but we definitely always can improve, and as we should improve. Because I love that you said the paper, To Err Is Human, the 1999 landmark paper, where they wanted to assess if we're delivering high quality, safe care. And what they found is generally, no, we are siloed, we're miscommunicating, we're not providing high quality care that's efficient, timely, patient centered, equitable, effective, etc. So, the thing I find about aviation that we could do tomorrow that I find is still lagging in healthcare is the just culture piece. Because aviation, they are espoused to report anything without any punitive measures. And we always say, we know humans are fallible, hence to err is human. But when someone does a fallible thing, the first thing we do in healthcare is, oh, why did you do that? That would never happen to me. That's a you problem. So what is just culture?
Oh, another great loaded question. I love this. Yeah, no, and look, you've hit the nail on the head, man. When we look at these other when we look at these other high reliability organizations, again, I'll just keep going back to aviation, right? They built the systems over decades, right? And had people operating in those safety systems. And we can see that, over the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, the 2000s. And as they kind of progressed there, they embedded their, for lack of a better word, just culture model that doesn't finger point at the person. So, just culture, as we kind of know it now, came out of James Reason's book in, I think it was 97, Managing the Risk of Organizational Culture, I believe it was. So, at that time, broadly speaking, just culture refers to a fair culture where, staff aren't unfairly blamed for incidents that were not their fault, but are held to account for their actions if there's evidence of, I think the term is like willful misconduct or gross negligence. So just sit with that for a second, because there's a lot in there. And I value just culture. I think, we can all kind of get behind that statement, right? From my perspective, there's kind of two issues with modern day just culture, right? So the first is that I think it has suffered kind of the same misunderstandings that human factors has. We see a lot of organizations, not just paramedicine, but across healthcare and things like that. Just culture is, and not to be cynical about it, but like just call a spade a spade. Just culture is a poster on a training room wall. And it's kind of been reduced to a buzzword in its meaning and application, right? So the example I use, right? If we are using a just culture where, we're not apportioning blame. And just to clarify that, like, just culture doesn't negate accountability. If someone does something willfully negligent or malicious, right? Like, that's an issue, obviously. But thankfully, I think everyone sitting here can say that's few and far between. There are some big names in the headlines that you can kind of say, no, that was fairly willful and malicious. But like, I think where it broke down, taking you back to paramedicine, like even in some of the parlances that are used from, a patient safety event perspective, right? And these would have been present up until, I left in 2020, right? Commission, omission, minor error, moderate error, critical error. So I know for me, I hear those words and that immediately brings to mind individual fault. Those connections are there. It suggests blame by an act or an inaction with a subsequent assignment of outcome. It's very individually focused, in my humble opinion. And I think this speaks to kind of the second issue. Like, we'll just use the example of patient safety reviews, right? So I think if we go back to our earlier conversation, I think a lot of time well-meaning individuals do these reviews with bits and pieces, maybe some tools here and tools there, to kind of tease out a system issue. but these reviews aren't necessarily completed or done with kind of underpinning human factors theories, principles, tools, things like that. It's I found this, I'm going to apply it here. Off we go. So like, one of the kind of examples I use is, right, like, paramedic, 3:00 in the morning. It is call 10, night shift 3 in a row, right? Goes to grab a medication, grabs atropine instead of adenosine. I don't know why. This is just something that happened. But the outcome is that, really bad for the patient. The review looks at potential factors using whatever model they want to use, right? So SEEPS, Yorkshire Contributing Factors Framework, there's loads of different models out there to tease apart and analyze an incident. But what I have found in my own experience, and I think what the literature also kind of says as well, is that like the output of those reviews still result in an error of omission, commission, critical error, things like that. So when we use these parlances, they really undermine what a just culture is. And I don't think that's fair to the patients. I don't think that's fair to the paramedics. And really broadly kind of undermines any sort of patient safety and human factors movement within the discipline, is my view on it anyway. So that's just culture now. So not too long ago, Decker, Oates, and Rafferty published a book called Restorative Just Culture, right, which prefaces kind of a new model. Is really interesting. And that new model, there's a checklist that's part of it, right? And just to kind of guide you through it. But it asks certain questions, right? So it asks who was hurt, whether that's emotionally, physically, whatever the case is. So it asks the first victim, right? Usually the patient, maybe a bystander. It also looks at the second victim, the practitioner, right? It looks at the organization itself. Maybe there's been some reputational damage. And then the broader community where the incident occurred, right? So it identifies this. And then it moves on to what do they need, right? So collaboratively exploring the needs arising from the harm done to support those individuals. The model also suggests like who is responsible to meet those needs, right? Maybe it's someone to facilitate the first victim in telling their story and their lived experience. And then maybe it's someone to support the second victim, the paramedic or the practitioner who is living with this guilt and fear of, something gone terribly wrong. These types of things. And then the last two steps on it, one of them is ready to forgive, which I think is really powerful because forgiveness is not a simple act, but it's a process between people, which fundamentally builds up that through just culture and healing relationship between the practitioner, the organization, the person affected, so on and so forth. I think that model itself is really powerful. And I think it's just the natural evolution of where just culture started back in 97 to where it is and where it's going now. So, that's kind of my take on that. And I think, when you see that checklist and you compare it to, I'm not picking on the NHS in the UK, but they just have a very easy model to follow, a just culture algorithm to follow, right? In the traditional sense, or the current iteration, I suppose, of just culture, if you look at that model, the very first line on the top is like something along the lines of, was there intent to cause harm? Man, like that from an incident learning perspective, an incident review perspective, that really sets people off on the wrong foot psychologically. It has biased you 100%. I understand why it's there. I totally get that, but like, if that's where you're starting, I don't know. It's, I don't think it's really fair to anyone. It's just a really loaded bias to start a review process with. So, I think it's complex. I think a lot of organizations do just culture well in some degrees, but I think in that early model, it's still kind of punitive in nature and something that can be improved on.
If this helped you think differently, share with someone who should hear it, and follow the show for more evidence-based conversations. This podcast is for educational and informational purposes only. It is not medical advice, does not establish a standard of care, and must not be used to diagnose, treat, or manage any medical condition or emergency. The content discussed reflects general principles that may not apply to every situation, system, or patient. Clinical practice varies by region, service, and jurisdiction. Always follow your local medical directives, clinical guidelines, protocols, and the instruction of your medical oversight or base hospital physician.